Welcome to the Lindsay Year Symposium. This is a symposium in which we're exploring the innovations and changes that were made during the years that John Lindsay was mayor of the city of New York, from 1966 to 1973, and the challenges and efforts that he undertook in order to make New York a livable city in a time that was quite tumultuous in the New York and the national history. I want to welcome you to this program and to join the program that's in progress. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to introduce Esther, as you see on the bio here, and probably the three things that I think are most important for my introduction to Esther today is, one, she clearly understands what it's like to be involved with government, as having been involved directly with the Bloomberg administration from its inception. She has a much larger perspective of government than just New York. She is the author of a book of Mayors and Money, which talked about the differences and similarities between Chicago and New York City, and out of that experience come away and is one of the few people who talk about the structural issues that organizational systems have to deal with in terms of trying to carry out business, and how structures can ultimately influence whether you can be successful or not. There is a game that we play that was developed up at MIT called the Beer Game, in which it's a very simple game. It's about people playing. The game has you running kind of a liquor store, and your job is to order and have enough beer to meet the demand from your clientele. And so people come in and they want to buy beer. You have to have enough in stock to meet the demand. You have to then be able to order up the chain, which to a distributor who in turn orders it from a factory. You get penalized if you have huge amount of inventory sitting around that you're not selling, and you kind of get penalized if when you come in and people want to buy from you and you don't have any. And then there's a couple of simple little delays in the process. And it's almost impossible to beat this game because you don't have enough information to play the game. And it sounds, well, it's a kind of a simple little model. It captures some of the realities of the challenges structurals place. And we often don't understand how structure affects outcomes. And I think one of the points that Esther has been wonderfully able to talk about is how some of that has influenced the history of New York and some of what happened during this period. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Esther Fuchs.
I think Stan is the first person who introduced me who has really encapsulated the argument in my book in 2 sentences, and that's quite extraordinary, and I really thank you for that. Usually people don't get what it's about. Anyway, I really just want to thank you all for inviting me today. The conference at Baruch is really very important, and not just for understanding John Lindsay's legacy, but for really expanding the scope of how we understand the role of mayors in the modern city. In many ways, Lindsay is really one of the first modern mayors. I know that so many of you were there. You were there in the trenches working with Lindsay. Many of you were brash young men, mostly men, idealistic and committed to making New York City a better place to live. And your story is really already part of the Lindsay legacy. But what Stan did today, I think, and tomorrow, by focusing this conference on public management, is really he's changing our way of thinking about Lindsay's contribution to making New York City a modern 21st century city. And I really, love this program, Innovation in the Bureau of the Budget. Peter Goldmark, David Grossman, Carter Bales, New York City's productivity program, Barbara Cohen, Ed Hamilton, Mark Holzer. I don't know about all of you, but I have never heard Lindsay's name linked to productivity or innovation in budgeting before this conference, and I think this is an important historical correction. Lindsay hired many of you who are obviously very talented public servants to work on the nuts and bolts of governance and to tackle the problem of providing effective and efficient services. And when you think about Lindsay in that context, this is not Lindsay the movie star or the matinee idol, but someone who understood the challenges of governing a modern global city. It really was about how to provide quality services to an increasingly impoverished population polarized by race, with industry and jobs leaving and the white middle class increasingly finding their American dream in the suburbs rather than in the ethnic neighborhoods of the 5 boroughs. What I hope you take away from my talk today is that Lindsay governed in a particular historical moment when America and its cities were undergoing an extraordinary set of transformations. And I think it's important when evaluating Lindsay's mayoralty that we keep that in mind, that while the perspective of individuals in the trenches I think are invaluable and rich, sometimes it's easy then to lose the forest for the trees. So I want to argue that there's no more important moment in 20th century New York City history than the 1975 fiscal crisis. And I would probably go on to say there's no more important moment in urban history in the United States than the 1975 fiscal crisis. And Lindsay is often blamed for making the decisions that caused the crisis during the Beam administration. So whether you look at Charles Morris's book, The Cost of Good Intentions, or Ken Auletta, The Streets Were Paved with Gold, or Marty Schefter, Political Crisis, Fiscal Crisis, they tell a similar story, and the names, the titles of these books are very telling, of course, about where they put the blame, how they explain what happened. Morris, The Cost of Good Intentions. Lindsay was about good intentions. Of course, he wanted to do the right thing, but it failed. And of course, Ken Auletta, The Streets Were Paved with Gold, that's the profligate story of Lindsay wasting the money that the city had on redistributive programs that we couldn't afford to do anymore. And Schefter's argument, while more expansive, basically looks at the 1960s as the important turning point for understanding the dynamic of the decision process in the Lindsay years. So from those kinds of analyses, there's really widespread view that Lindsay was an ineffective manager at best, spent profligately on social services, and mortgaged the city's future by using revenues from the capital budget for operating expenses. I don't have to explain that to everybody in this room, but that's the summary view of, what he did. So I'd like to engage you with 2 ideas that I hope will change the way we think about Lindsay and the 1975 fiscal crisis. First, I want to briefly develop the historical context for analyzing Lindsay. And second, I want to consider Lindsay's decisions, as Ken pointed out, from a structural perspective. What were the political and economic factors which affected the decision-making capacity of all mayors in this period, not just John Lindsay? It's so instructive to look at things from a comparative perspective. I have so much trouble, for example, with Caro's book on Robert Moses. And of course, it's the problem of biography also, because Caro blames Moses for everything that went wrong in that period in New York City. Yet, if you look at every major city across the country, everybody was building similar kinds of projects that Caro built, and there was no Caro there. But they managed to do it because there was a federal government sending money to cities precisely to do this. And you had to be stupid to pass up that money. So pretty much it didn't matter whether you were in New York, Chicago, Boston, or Los Angeles, you were building, and you were building similar kinds of projects. Of course, there's human agency, and I'll get to that. But the comparative perspective really can change the way you think about the decision process. So I don't want to argue that there are no choices to be made by mayors or individuals, or there's no responsibility for decisions. I was on a panel at the museum with some of the smartest people I've ever met, and the issue was who's responsible. And Stephen Berger said, well, if you don't pinpoint responsibility, if you try and talk about everybody being responsible, then nobody's responsible. I think that kind of misses the point. Of course the mayor is responsible, but again, we want to look at the constraints that might have impacted the choices that the mayor had in that period. So first, the question of the historical context, and I'll do that very briefly. Again, this issue of the considering the success or failures of individual mayors, we focus on this concept of leadership. Leadership is very popular. I know people have raised a lot of money around leadership, and there are all kinds of institutes on leadership studies, and they teach courses on leadership, and you know, I am a bona fide and certified professor of political science and public policy, and you will never get me to teach a leadership course. You want to talk about leadership and what makes a good leader, but we all know that the kids who take those courses are not likely to be the next leaders. And so the focus on leadership, I think, is kind of misguided here in the same way that we focus on sort of the individual as the prime mover in making these important decisions. I think in this period, what we have to remember, and other people have brought this up, we're coming to this period with a new lens, the lens of evaluating cities on how well they balance their budget, this fiscal policy process. For those of you who lived through that period, and for those who simply study that period, I would suggest to you that during that period, there was virtually no mention of the issues of fiscal policy, balancing the budget. People worried about balancing the budget and where they were going to get the money from, but were editorial writers lamenting about whether you could balance your budget and what kind of impact it would have on the future of the city? Were academics writing about fiscal policy? There was nothing in the literature. When New York City had its fiscal crisis in '75, nobody in political science almost at all was writing about the politics of the budget process or fiscal policy as an issue. And we come to this and evaluate Lindsay on the issue of fiscal policy as if this was the prime issue on the political agenda in that point in time, and he ignored it. In fact, what I learned from one of these sessions is that Lindsay actually in his first term tried very hard to deal with some of the fundamental problems in New York City's budget, and of course there was a Board of Estimate at the time. He was, in that regard, structurally a weak mayor, and he lost, frankly, in some of his proposals for raising taxes and for cutting spending that might have put the city in a better situation in 1975. And in fact, in my research on Chicago and New York, which I found to be, you know, a wonderful way of comparing cities over time on this issue of fiscal policy, Lindsay, who is viewed as a failure by most on this issue, if you compare him to Mayor Daley was highly successful. He balanced the budget in Chicago under a similar set of economic conditions because of a whole range of things that I'll talk about in a moment. But in fact, the evaluations of Daley are on race relations in that period, of course, and on whether or not your city was burning to the ground, and whether or not you gave an order to your police department to shoot to kill. And Lindsay was a hero, and Daley was the goat. And then, you know, in the revisionist history of what's now important, but wasn't important then, Daley happened to be an excellent manager and understood these fiscal issues and also had the political capacity to do many things that you couldn't do in New York, which is what I want to talk about. And he looked like he did the spectacular job, and Lindsay, of course, was not able to do the kinds of things that Daley did. So I think that it's very important to understand when we're doing this kind of evaluation that it's all well and good to look at it as an academic exercise, but to frame the question in a way that the person who was in charge at the time deliberately ignored important issues that we understand today to be important really kind of misses the boat on political agenda setting and how we determine what is important in a particular historical moment. And I think I can say pretty accurately that fiscal policy was not important in this period compared to the issues of race relations and poverty and how to make sure our city didn't burn to the ground. So, putting that aside for the moment as context also, it's my position basically that you need a long-term historical perspective to really understand what happened in 1975 in New York City politics. And you also need a comparative perspective, because what I want to also mention is just bear in mind that in the 1970s, cities like Cleveland, Detroit, and Providence were experiencing fiscal problems. And in the 1980s, the same thing happened in Houston, Dallas, and Tulsa. And I particularly love the Houston example. In fact, when I used to teach the big undergraduate lecture course in urban politics, my students would always look at me very quizzically because I'd start describing this period and I would say, and I would be gleeful, almost happy and smiling and say, and Houston had a fiscal crisis. And they would look at me like I was insane. And I was gleeful and happy about that, because if you remember what the position of the rest of the country was about New York City in 1975 was, you did this by your poor decision-making processes, by your wasteful spending, by all of your mismanagement, and by your overbearing concern for poor people. And so we in Houston, of course, we managed better, but of course when oil crashed in Houston, it turned out they didn't manage much better than we did in New York. And they had to face some similar structural problems as we had to face. So, keeping that in perspective, I think, is important. And if you go back to the 1930s, which I did, almost every major city in the country experienced a fiscal crisis, some of which went bankrupt in the 1930s. So, and certainly where we might end and move forward is we look at 2010, of course, and we see over again fiscal problems emerging not just in the cities but in the states. So that should give us pause about how much an individual is really responsible for something that seems to be happening both over time and across the nation. I think that is amazing. Today, I don't know if anybody ever reads the LA. LA is almost bankrupt. Los Angeles is almost bankrupt. It's having a worse set of problems than New York City had in '75 because its state government is also almost bankrupt, and it has a political structure that's probably worse than New York City for being able to create fiscally responsible decisions. So it's really important then to keep these two perspectives in mind. So what I'd like to do now is just briefly go into how I analyzed New York City in some of my own research in order to understand the fiscal crisis in '75 and why it's important to understand it from this broader structural perspectives. The fundamental question is really political. The economists have been looking at this for a long time, and basically when we look at trends, we know that when there are economic downturns, the revenue base of cities decline, and therefore tax dollars decline, and then it makes it more difficult to balance your budget. So there's some very basic connection between economic growth, economic scarcity, and the ability of cities to balance their budgets. That's pretty obvious and straightforward, and I think that hasn't gone away, and I'm not disagreeing with that. But within the context of this ebb and flow in the economy, I would suggest to you that there's different political structures that either help mayors make these decisions in a more responsible way, these policy decisions, or actually hurt them and make it more difficult for them to make ultimately fiscally responsible policy decisions. So it's a question of how badly are you going to succumb to the economic cycles that you can control, which may be really national in scope. Our economies are not controlled by our local governments. We don't even have regional governance to work with labor markets and economic cycles. We're pretty much at the mercy of the national government for this. And they don't do that well for cities, and that's, of course, part of the problem. So I don't want to, in this analysis, then view cities as simply the victims of economic trends. And what I want to do is really think about the political processes and the structures that are in place that affect the city's ability to sort of use its economic base effectively, even in periods when they're losing tax revenue and when they can control the consequences of economic decline. And I would also suggest to you that this sort of political structural dimension of the urban crisis, which is what I call it, has really kind of been the last to be understood, even though we have a lot of literature out there which looked at the New York City fiscal crisis itself. What I think is powerful in some of those books that I mentioned is the micro detail. I just want to be clear that there were short-term triggers to the fiscal crisis. Of course, funds from the capital budget were used for the operating budget. There were some bad management decisions that were made. All of those things are true, but that's just the short-term trigger that I would argue takes place in this larger political context. So what are the political factors that really enable a city to endure economic scarcity without fiscal problems? If they can or cannot, I think is still an open question. I mean, I want to reframe that. Cities can endure economic scarcity without fiscal problems. All they've got to do is cut the guts out of their budgets, basically. And by the way, and I know this is a little controversial, but hey, why not? In 1975, there is always this big kumbaya story. All the interest groups got together, and all the unions and the bankers, and everybody got together to make sure through the Financial Control Board and the Municipal Assistance Corporation that the city didn't go bankrupt. Yes, this is important. It's an important story, and it would have been bad if the city went bankrupt. But in fact, I would suggest to you that the way we resolved the fiscal crisis in 1975 just sowed the seeds for the future problems that we still have in place right now, and the structural problems that were in place, some of which were changed, but most of which were not. I mean, if you look at the Financial Control Board and what happened, the banks got paid first. Now, maybe in a bankruptcy, the banks would have got paid first anyway, but that's what they cared about. They wanted that debt repaid. It was important. I'm not like, one of these people who don't get that you have to re-enter the bond market, and it's very important, and I'm not advocating bankruptcy. But I would suggest to you that the unions and the banks and the major municipal interests that put together that bailout package, they were most concerned with keeping their political power in place. Banks wanted to get repaid, the unions wanted to keep control of whatever they controlled, and the kind of bailout that we put in place was primarily targeting a certain tax stream for the banks and cutting the guts out of basic services to the point in which they don't really come back till way late in the Koch administration. Whoever lived in the post-75 period knows what the city looked like. And it looked like that because there was no money in the budget. And one thing I have to say about my former boss, Mayor Bloomberg, when he took office, we were hitting a set of fiscal problems again. Giuliani, who liked to characterize himself as a great manager, I think we could characterize him somewhat differently than that. Bloomberg was left a deficit in the budget that was proportionately larger than what the city faced in '75. And he decided to raise property taxes by 18.5%, not a politically hot thing to do. In fact, his approval ratings went immediately down the drain. And also borrowed and did a whole variety of things in order to retain a commitment to basic city services. He was not going to cut police, cut fire, and other services, of course, that are important to the quality of life of cities, because that long road to come back that the city had, which most people wouldn't believe really happened if you were sitting back in 1975. People wrote off the cities, not just New York. Every city in this country was basically written off. We were going to be a suburban nation. There was not going to be any cities anymore. So, the Bloomberg decision was very clear and I think very prescient. He understood that he did not have that choice again. If he wanted to continue the economic growth and this idea that New York was going to be a place where middle-class people wanted to live again and businesses wanted to do business, that you needed to protect the quality of life. And the quality of life is about the range of basic services that government funds. And so he refused to do the kind of cutbacks that occurred in 75. So I would suggest, maybe that's all that could be done. I can't second guess. Other people here know more than I do. But certainly that wasn't the kinds of decisions that were going to protect the city into the future or set up a structure that would allow us to move forward in a way that we wouldn't have to confront these cyclical fiscal problems. So what I want to put on the table is sort of the basic framework for analyzing structure. And I went back to the 1930s, and I really believe, and this is why I'm more of a Lindsay defender than even people who work for him, because I think Lindsay was in a cycle that really started in the 1930s in New York City, and in most cities that's the important other period in the 20th century for understanding the modern city. Basically, in the 1930s we developed a city that was expansive in its approach to the provision of services. We did not wait for the state in New York to do anything. We taxed ourselves and we provided the services even during a depressionary period. And so we took the burden away from other governmental jurisdictions and we put it on local government, which at the time, from a political point of view, seemed like the right thing to do since nobody else was stepping up to the plate. But that becomes institutionalized over time. And so if you look at the trends in budgeting in New York, there's no period in which the budget declines. You may cut back the rate of growth, but if you do it in constant dollars, the budget really doesn't decline. For this whole period, it's a constant period of growth and expansion in the functional scope of what the city does. Also, we have in our formal legal structure very little capacity, even though we have a strong mayor now. The mayor wasn't as strong, obviously, in the Lindsay period, but assuming for the moment it's a strong mayor structure, we have very little capacity to raise our own revenues, as every city in the country has to deal with this problem of fiscal federalism. You have to go to the state to get the legal authority to tax. So your tax structure is not going to be that rational because Home Rule has given the city a lot of authority around property taxes. So most cities across the country rely on property taxes. New York extended its taxing authority, but most of those decisions were made through political compromises, and not if somebody sat down in a corner and rationally figured out, what would make the most sense, what would be the most sensible tax structure for the city. Moreover, the state, of course, mandates spending, and the federal government mandates spending for the city. So when you look at a city budget, how much flexibility is in that budget for the mayor? It's probably less than 30% of the budget that you have any discretion over. Because you're mandated spending. And we in New York, of course, have the added burdens of spending on Medicaid and welfare, or what is now called TANF. And it used to be, in this period, it was 50% of the state share. No other city in the country had that 50% of the state share. So when we're blaming Lindsay for for expanding the welfare rolls, it's a sort of ludicrous thing. He didn't expand the welfare rolls. These people were eligible under federal law. He didn't make them eligible. I mean, the only alternative to that is to say to people who are eligible to try and prevent them from getting on the rolls. And that's what happened, by the way, in the Giuliani period. You can set up bureaucratic obstruction and keep people off the rolls. But the eligibility criteria were not created by Lindsay in that period. He was following federal mandates. And of course, what needed to happen is the federal government needs to federalize social welfare spending. It's not the thing that in any other modern city do you have local governments responsible for what one of my mentors, Paul Peterson, would call redistributive services. Local governments should not be doing redistributive services. Maybe they should be providing them operationally, but fiscally, they don't have the capacity. It's a ridiculous thing to use local tax dollars for redistribution, because what it does is tell people who are making rational decisions, I need to live where there are no poor people. Because if I live where the poor people are, I'm going to get taxed to support them. And of course, you know, the economists argue that the flight of middle class out of the city was partly due to this burden. I mean, we have no way of really testing that, but the reality is that if they're right about anything, there is evidence now with, you know, jurisdictions which tried to add to their redistributive burden. People were worried about the race to the top as opposed to the race to the bottom, because they were worried literally that poor people would make decisions on where they wanted to live based upon the quality of the welfare package. And there's some evidence looking at migration between Chicago and Houston, actually, that people were making that decision for a while. The truth is that poor people are the least mobile people in our populations, and so it's a hard stretch. But from a fiscal point of view, this responsibility that New York has that is very different than almost any other city puts a permanent fiscal burden on the city and on its tax base. And so this is part of the intergovernmental framework and part of the mandate framework. So we've got past budgetary decisions which constrain mayors. I would suggest, and there's good evidence to support this, that it's much harder to turn around a budget, that is to say, to cut it, when it's been growing for 30 years, than if you have periods and the public is used to periods of growth and decline. So as a political decision maker, there's less leeway in your capacity to convince the people in this process to engage in cutbacks. We have a different rhetoric now, which is what I would call the post-fiscal crisis rhetoric. So mayors have a little more capacity to do this. But certainly in this period, there was no memory or experience with this idea that we should do more with less and live with scarcity and, you know, accept the cutbacks that would come ultimately from a shrinkage of the tax base. But the other pieces of the puzzle in the structure, which are sort of softer, are just as important. It's not just formal legal arrangements or federalism or intergovernmental relations. It's also interest group demands and the local party organization. And some of the most interesting things that I learned in my research was looking at the role of interest groups and parties and looking at the budgets in different electoral cycles. And this is where I will use the Chicago example because it's sort of too informative to leave out. In these trends, in these budget trends, when you look at them by mayoral administration, you see in New York that there's always a spike in the year before the election. So while there's a spike, you know, while the trend line is always going up, you get a spike in the year before election. In Chicago, there was a spike, even though this was a much more volatile budget process. There were declines and growth periods. But you also got a spike in the year after the election. So, you know, in talking to people, I think we could explain this in a simple way. New York, by this time, had weak party organizations. People describe New York City politics as street fight and pluralism. Interest groups out there demanding. What are they demanding? They're demanding a piece of the budget. I mean, that's what it's about. Power in any city is about getting government to spend on what you want it to spend on, particularly in local politics. And the budget is a political document, ultimately, and it tells you about the priorities. But where does that come from? Well, it primarily, in these periods, you could see mayors trying to put together their coalition for re-election. So I would suggest to you that in New York, because of the weak party, interest group politics dominates. That's a much more expensive model, which is to say you have to pay more before to get those people on board, or at least make those promises and put something out afterwards. I'm being a little cavalier here, but really the data supports it. You have to make those promises and then pay some of it out in the year after you get elected. So New York City mayors have had to put together these free-floating coalitions to get elected. They're not the same every time, but they never had, they didn't have anymore in this period a strong party organization which produces a coalition for you without a lot of work. Those are the people on your team that you can count on, and while there are costs to the strong party model, they tend to get paid after the election. If you stay with me, you're loyal, you'll get your reward after the election, whether it's a job or whatever else goes into that party patronage model. It turns out from this data that I've collected at least, that the party patronage model is actually cheaper than the interest group politics model. And that the interest group politics model is the New York City model, and it's been very costly for mayors who have a very difficult time saying no to interest group demands. And that continues to be an issue in New York City politics. Now, what we have now is the rhetoric of fiscal crisis to scare the hell out of everybody, and we've seen what it did in '75, so smart mayors use that as leverage in this negotiating process, and you can see it, the reality of it, in place. So mayors can sort of put a lid on spending in crisis periods. So there's advantage to revving up the crisis, because then the public understands at least there's a lot at stake. But in periods of normal politics, actually, again, once things get back to where they were in the middle of the Koch administration, off we go again in this expansive budget growing trend that we have in place. And the fiscal crisis is just becomes a moment in history that's anomalous because of the crisis and, of course, the structures that were put in place to put a brake on New York City spending. Mayors don't have it, and we can't do that anymore. So what I would conclude by saying is from the 30s and from this sort of historical analysis, what we learn is that New York City in the 1930s began expanding its functional responsibilities and increasing general programmatic spending with no commensurate increase of assistance from fiscal authorities outside the city, whether it was regional authorities, special districts, the state, or the national government. There's no increase in revenue coming in from outside of the city. The consequence is, of course, is that if you expand the scope of government, you've got to pay for it somehow. It's going to come from the local tax base primarily. And the party organization in this period began to disintegrate, and its relationship with the federal government was certainly not cooperative in New York. I mean, the decline in federal spending is also part of the untold story, and it starts with Jimmy Carter, not with Ronald Reagan. Look at the data. It's 1979 where the federal government starts decreasing intergovernmental revenue to cities. And, you know, the cities are weak, again, in the national system, and they're weak in the electoral system as well. Ronald Reagan is the first president to win an election without winning in one of the major, largest cities in the country. He loses every single large city in the country but can win. It was the beginning of a new formulation of an electoral coalition that left the cities out. Of course, this has, you know, recently changed to a certain extent with the changing population of central cities, but it could go back the same way it had. So in this period in the 30s, city government in New York became the focus for the demands of many competing interests. And the mayor's control over fiscal policy really becomes weakened as a consequence of this. And this weakness is institutionalized, and then the decision process is more dependent upon personal resources of a mayor and the kinds of negotiating skills that they bring to this process of aggregating interest groups' demands. A crisis occurred in New York City in 1975, not because of John Lindsay primarily, but because the mayor was locked into this structure of political relationships. And I would suggest to you finally that things have really not changed sufficiently, that we are engaging right now in a similar kind of process, except we have a little bit more knowledge, we have better management techniques, and that helps, by the way, because you can do the cutbacks in a more efficient kind of way, hopefully, if you work on the management side. So I'm not suggesting that management is irrelevant to this. Management's very important. You compare New York to New Orleans, and that tells you the story. New Orleans had a crisis. But what we really found out from Hurricane Katrina is that New Orleans didn't work before Hurricane Katrina. So there was no reason to think it was going to work afterwards. They had their police department disappeared. Their education system was falling apart. They could not collect the garbage. I'm talking about basic city services of police, fire, and sanitation, not to mention public health and education and everything else. They couldn't do it before. They weren't going to be able to do it after. So the management issues in terms of capacity to govern, of course, remain important. But the fiscal crises and the things that trigger it when you look at it from a structural perspective are continuing to impact our cities. And if we're really expecting our cities to compete globally, and many have done so, and they must they have to continue to do this. We are in a global economy, that's what they tell us every day. We're at a structural disadvantage. There's no cities in the developing world or in the developed world that have the kind of constraints on city governments when it comes to taxing and spending that American cities have. And if the Lindsay period can tell us a lot about what we have to do for our cities and what we should have done in the past, I think that it can tell us a lot about what we need to do for our cities, and especially New York, in the 21st century. Thank you.
A very good analysis, and I thank you for it. One point, however, with respect to welfare, when you indicated the city had no control whatsoever, it was mandated by federal legislation and so on and so forth, I will say this. I was present in the Blue Room in City Hall during Mayor Lindsay's regular Friday morning cabinet meeting when Mitch Ginsburg, the administrator of the Human Resources Administration,
May he rest in
announced
peace.
May
he rest in peace.
May he rest in peace. Announced the following plan that was ultimately accepted by the mayor. He said, what we should do is make it really easy for people to apply for welfare. Let's relax the standards as much as possible, encourage people to sign up, because it really is an economic development program for the city of New York. He used that terminology. He said a huge flow of money would come in from Washington, and that would be an economic boom for New York City. And the end result was a one-page self-declaration of eligibility for welfare rights. So
you're making an important point, and of course, it's difficult to cover everything in short remarks. I'm aware of Mitch Ginsburg's role in helping to restructure the city's welfare system, and I'm aware that the welfare rolls expanded in New York City in that period. I would make 2 points. One, the welfare rolls expanded in every city in that period because there was a recognition that there were poor people in the city who were eligible by the federal standards who were not getting welfare. So Mitch Ginsburg did not make people eligible who were not eligible under the federal guidelines. I understand that you can make it more difficult or you can make it easier to get on the rolls. I made that point myself. And yes, Mitch Ginsburg made it easier to get on the rolls, but he could not make people eligible who were not eligible under the federal guidelines. And this was a period in which, as a nation and as a city, we were deciding that there were a lot of poor people in our cities who should have been eligible for welfare who were not eligible. I mean, welfare is a whole another conversation about what went wrong with the welfare system and how it impacted cities. And it's an important conversation, and I think there were a lot of problems in the welfare system, and the transformation of adding work and personal responsibility I actually support, and I think were very important. My point is just a much larger point, that this was happening everywhere and that this was federally mandated and condoned. He could have, exercised a different kind of discretion, as I said, and made it more difficult through bureaucratic maneuvers. I believe that would have been the wrong thing to do, given these people were poor and eligible under the federal guidelines.
I'm Dave Seeley, who came up to work for Mayor Lindsay on education, which is my perspective. But first of all, I want to say I think that was a really brilliant talk from my perspective, which is education and its management and problems. Now, I was told by Stan that this whole conference is not dealing with education, it's dealing with other things under the mayor. But I think there's some real lessons. I just want to take 2 points from my own experience with Lindsay that should get on the record. Mostly supporting what you're saying, but with some little twists in it. When I first came up here, I came up in the summer of '67, and Fred Hayes was one of my main mentors as to what the situation was. And very quickly, I think we came to agreement that the public education system was one of the most inefficient systems we run. From my perspective, most easily seen by the fact that most of the major workers, who are the students, are not working to anywhere near their capacity. So any system that is working with most of its workers not working very hard and not committed to their work is going to be extremely inefficient. We agreed on that, and we also agreed that something had to be done about it by the mayor, he invited me up because he had decided that he would get involved in education, although, as you all know, it was not his responsibility. Those days, the mayor didn't have anything to do directly with running the schools, but he decided that it had to be tackled from the point of view of the future of the city. And so the little hold he had on the school system was budget. The city was paying about a third of the budget. And Fred Hayes was in charge of the budget, and he had hoped through the budget process we could get some management sense into the school system. And I'll just say it was just totally frustrating when he arrived that he felt he was being totally frustrated by the school system and by the education community, who said the mayor should stay out of not getting involved in education. So it was very difficult for him. However, in terms of your point about funding for the cities, they certainly had hit it, long before I arrived, they had certainly hit on the point that two-thirds of the budget was being paid through state, and mostly state and some federal money, very little federal at that time. And he decided that, well, one of the cures for that would be indeed to increase the state funding for the cities. And he worked on that, and that is, of course, what led to the decentralization issue. The state said you can't decentralize by carving the city into different funding systems. We would get 200 or 300 million, which meant a lot of money in those days, believe it or not, by just doing the formula based on 5 boroughs. And they couldn't get that through the legislature and said, unless you really decentralize. And then they gave the mayor the power to come up with a plan for decentralizing, which put him in the fix that led to the worst fiasco the city's ever seen. But nonetheless, he was working on that. He was working on your thesis. We have to get money from outside. And there's a lot else to say about why that's not the topic of this thing, but what we could learn from the fiasco of his effort to try to get better management into the education system is a whole other topic. But a little thing on the fiscal issue, but when I went off later and worked for the Public Education Association, we became very concerned that the expenses were far outstripping revenues. And the city was borrowing. It was decided that the money for the vocational schools should be borrowed because, after all, that's a capital expense. And I went to see David Grossman, I'm almost certain it was David Grossman by that time, who said I was completely crazy because at this point, he said, we can borrow money so cheaply that it's insane fiscally not to borrow money because we'll pay it back with much cheaper dollars. So I'll just add those two items to the record.
Thank you. The borrowing is a great story because people knew it was cheap to borrow. So why should you go through the political process of trying to raise taxes and all that pain when you can borrow? So that clearly indicates part of what I was trying to say.
I will try not to get into the issue of the merits of borrowing. I did want to, however, tell a story, since you're an expert on New York and Chicago, to the best of my knowledge, the only person who worked for the first Daley administration in Chicago at a high level and also worked for the Lindsay administration as a commissioner of public works. There's a man named John Duba. John came to New York, I can remember, after our previous public works commissioner had died, and he was appointed. And since I was deputy budget director at the time and had responsibility for the capital budget, I felt it was appropriate for me to call John and have lunch with him to talk about what things we had in common. We had a very pleasant lunch in Chinatown and talked about things, at the end of which he thanked me, and he said it was very good. I told him a lot of very useful things about New York, but he said, "You haven't told me the real things." I said, "John, what is that?" He said, "You haven't told me how the orders will come from City Hall to tell me what to do." And I said, "John, this is New York. Nobody's going to tell you what to do. You got to decide yourself." He said, "That's anarchy."
Thank you, David Grossman. That is a wonderful story, and I think really illustrates the point I was trying to make.
I'm Arnold Gore, and I was an employee of the Human Resources Administration during some of the period that you were referring to regarding the declaration for eligibility for public assistance. And I would like to point out that not only was it very effective in that it did expand roles, but it also would have been much more costly if the prior procedure had been left in place of a full investigation for the people who had been presumptively unknown as eligible. The investigation process used to take something like, you were allowed something like 3 or 4 weeks to make a determination. If all of those people were employed investigating each of the individuals who applied for public assistance, we would have had a fiscal crisis earlier, and, well, it would have been paid, the money would have been paid not to the eligible welfare clients, but to our staff of investigators who were running around the city trying to investigate all these people. I remember there used to be a joke among the other people who worked for the Human Resources Administration at that time that they would say, the only growth industry of the city is this Department of Social Services. And if it keeps on growing like this, you know, we have an unlimited future. Now, the Lindsay administration saw that as a possibility. And they could not fund an unbelievable outgrowth of people running after other people to check whether they are right. When an independent audit was done of the people who had filled out the declaration of eligibility, less than 1% had been shown to be fraudulent. So it was very cost effective to implement that, although it got very bad press.
Wow. Thank you. That's very, very important story, I think. Cost effectiveness can be seen in a large variety of ways. And in fact, on the issue of presumptive eligibility and fraud, it continues to be shown that there's very little fraud, even though it's been used ideologically to attack social service recipients. The amount of money that gets lost in fraud is nowhere near close to some of the stringent things that were put in the Giuliani administration to detect fraud.
I'm Alicia Zanelli, and I came here to learn. But you mentioned in 3 things about for New York City to become global, 3 issues. And I think that education is basic. You see, we actually, and in general in the United States, because I was educated in my country, we are not competitive because of the lack of education. You know, North Americans have been deprived of a foreign language. You know, and that's one of the things. All over Europe, South America, we speak more than 1 language. That's since the moment you are born, practically, and you go to school, and we speak it properly. The mayor now has created the charter schools, but that's taking away from the public system. And the big difference, I think, that's my opinion, is that what he has established is discipline. why, if he's really involved in education, to make it better, not to discipline the public system?
Okay. Well, your point about education is very important, and what I would say here as it relates to the issues of structure is that Bloomberg did something, and it goes back to the earlier question that the gentleman asked. He actually restructured public education by getting mayoral authority from the state legislature. This has been very, very important. Whether you agree with what he did or you disagree with what he did or you think it's successful or it's not successful, the change in structure has at least given mayors legal authority to bring reform to a system that has been failing for a very long time. Your point about education and competitiveness is absolutely right. The other thing that Bloomberg did, which I think is important, is in his rhetoric, in his speaking and thinking about policy, he moved education out of the sort of second tier of services that were not considered basic to the city. Mayors always talked about education, but they never had to do anything about it because they could say, the Board of Education controls this. Even if they had that 30% of the budget and a lot of authority, it was too complicated, too difficult, and really nobody wanted to be burdened with education when they went into an election process because a lot of people thought it was unfixable. Bloomberg stepped in and said, I want responsibility and I want accountability here, and education is fundamental and basic to making this city work. It's a basic service that every child in the city deserves regardless of income. He's the first mayor not just to say that, but to do something about it and to say, hold me accountable on this issue. So I think that restructuring around education has been very important. And part of his legacy will be evaluated on both the restructuring and what he has done substantively over time. And I think there's been substantial changes. It's not perfect, and there needs to be more work done, but I think the system is moving in the right direction on education.
This is the conclusion of this segment of the Lindsay Year Symposium, in which we've been looking at innovations that were introduced into the operation of New York City government from 1966 through 1973. This symposium is being held at Baruch College, and I look forward to seeing you when we return for the next installment of this symposium.